We're going to get started here. Let me in speaker. All right, today's presenter is Matthew Siegel. Matthew is a transdisciplinary researcher, writer, teacher, and philosopher applying process relational thought across the natural and social sciences as well as the study of consciousness. He is an associate professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness Department at California Institute of Integral Studies in San Fran, and the chair of the Science Advisory Committee for the Cobb Institute. Matthew, I'm so glad you're here. Welcome, and take it away. Just remember, everyone, keep yourself muted until the presentation is over. All right, Matthew, what are you going to share today?
Thanks, Rigel. Yeah, really excited to be here with such a healthy-sized audience of people. This is a great community you got going, Steve here and Rigel. So I'm going to talk about Rudolf Steiner and his proposal, which he introduced in 1919, right after World War I, in Central Europe, in Stuttgart, Germany in particular. I think this proposal is very much still relevant to our time, and I also think it resonates at least somewhat, and maybe quite profoundly, with a sort of developmental understanding of human history, human psychology, and politics. So the first thing, though, I have to say is I have about a half hour. Is that right? Is that the ideal? Okay. I gave a talk on this subject. Oh, sorry, Steve, you're trying to say something again, but I don't hear you.
I just wanted to say, feel free to take more than half an hour. Just let it be an organic expression.
Sure. Okay. I'll aim for 30 minutes. The good news is, if you want all of the sort of historical details about Steiner, his biography, and the history, I mean, this group probably knows quite a bit about the history of the 20th century. In Europe and the US, but I'm not going to have time to go into all of that, but I did give a talk on this yesterday, as I said. Just by chance, I was invited to give a talk on the same subject by two different groups. So I'll share a link to that talk if anyone wants to see the recording for some of those details. Let me share my screen and run through a couple of... Oh, I'm going to have to boot you, Rigel. I think you had music being shared earlier.
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
Can everybody see that first slide there? Cool. So, a little disclosure. First of all, I have a couple of AI-generated images of Steiner. This is one of them. I'll have a real picture of him later. I'm going to focus on the threefold structure and some of the ideas that Steiner made about money and banking and his understanding of politics, his understanding of cultural life, and share less about his biography and the history. But the history is really important, so I have to say a few things about that. But before I even get into that, let me just share right up front some of the resonances that I do think exist between developmental worldview, a kind of integral understanding of the evolution of consciousness, right? That right there, the evolution of consciousness, would be a major area of overlap, I would think. Steiner definitely understands human history, human society, and human individuality as caught up in this coevolutionary process that's really cosmic in its extent. And, obviously, today we'll be looking specifically at how he applies his anthroposophic cosmology, really, and spiritual worldview to social issues. But there's a lot of background here, and I'll only be able to introduce a little bit of his understanding of consciousness and evolution. He also thinks of human society as in an organic way, as an arena wherein there will always be tensions that need to be managed. This isn't a utopian proposal. This is a way of acknowledging a certain form of internal differentiation which has characterized the human species over the course of thousands of years of evolution, and identifying these what he would call these deep primal thoughts or ideas that have been driving human evolution collectively for millennia, and trying to further those deep impulses. So he's not trying to introduce something new, really. This isn't a new theory of human society. It's Steiner saying, hey, look at history, look at how the political, legal rights sphere, as he would call it, has gradually come to differentiate itself from the economic sphere, from market and trade and money and these things, and also from the cultural sphere, which, is everything from education and religion and science and art to media and sports. The cultural sphere is quite large in terms of these three spheres that Steiner identifies: the political, the economic, and the cultural. And really, human life should be about cultural expression and the freedom to develop as individuals, including our associations with other individuals. And Steiner's just really trying to connect with a process he sees that's already underway and to allow us to consciously engage in this differentiation, which has been going on, again, he thinks, for most of human history, not to arrive at a utopia, but at a healthier way of holding these tensions between different deep impulses that we feel as human beings toward fellowship with one another, but also freedom for ourselves as individuals. And so this threefold understanding is an attempt, right, not at the perfect society, but at a more organically healthy, functioning society. This is also, as I said, it's not a theory, and we certainly don't want to imagine it as such and then go about trying to impose it upon different historical and cultural social situations. Steiner introduces this in 1919 in Stuttgart, right, in the context of Central European culture. And after a year or two, the conditions had changed. I'll talk a little bit about those conditions. But he realized this isn't going to work anymore. We have to pull back. I'm going to focus more on the cultural sphere, in particular education. Steiner creates Waldorf education at this time, which nowadays is the largest private school movement in the world, I believe. And wasn't trying to force this proposal when the conditions weren't right, and he kind of retreated after a bit to plant seeds for the future. And so when we try to apply threefolding in our own time, and in a different country and different circumstances, we should be aware of the fact that this isn't a blueprint or a mold that we can just stamp onto our situation. We really have to find a way to connect with the living impulses in the ideas that I'll lay out, and then see how they might apply to our place and time. So, that said, let me say a little bit about why I'm interested in Steiner, and then tell you a little bit about his biography, what the social problem was a century ago that he introduced threefolding to address, and then I'll get into threefolding itself and hopefully spend most of the time addressing how these three spheres interact and how Steiner came to this understanding. So, as a philosopher, I do a lot of transdisciplinary research. I like to be in dialogue with natural scientists, physicists, biologists, neuroscientists, and I also am deeply interested in consciousness. And as far as I'm concerned, the natural sciences aren't yet very well equipped to actually study consciousness, because if we do have a more spiritual inclination and view consciousness as this power, this agency, this medium that we exist within and that we can actively cultivate and deepen, it seems to me that natural science, with its methods of empirical measurement, mathematical calculation, and so on, just consciousness doesn't even show up for it, right? What shows up is the brain, and we can learn a lot of interesting things by studying the brain, but I'm not sure how much we can learn about consciousness. And so Rudolf Steiner is a figure who understood natural science quite deeply and studied it, but also had this deeper spiritual understanding of consciousness, and allows us to take a spiritual sort of view of consciousness and its evolution seriously, while still remaining in dialogue with and consistent with natural science. And so he's been an important influence on my own thinking as I try to, do that same thing nowadays. So Steiner was born in 1861, dies in 1925. probably of cancer. Some think he was poisoned. Some think it was the Nazis who were rising at that time in Europe, in Germany, who poisoned him. But he dies, early, and was in the midst of a really creative time, both in regards to the Threefolding movement, which starts in 1919, introducing Waldorf education, introducing a number of other initiatives across agriculture and medicine and the arts. But his whole proposal for the renewal of our social relationships with one another stems from his anthroposophical spirituality. And at the core of that so-called anthroposophy, or wisdom of the human, as he referred to it, is a certain view of human freedom and an understanding of our own intuitive thinking capacity as the way in which we, even in our everyday normal lives, just by virtue of the fact that we have this thinking capacity that we all take for granted, we're actually connected directly to the spiritual world. Our own I, right, the first person pronoun, our own self, not as an object or an entity or a substance, but as an activity that we can actively engage in and sculpt and express, is for Steiner the portal to the spiritual world. And he has a whole bunch of things to say about that spiritual world, which I'm not going to get into today, but you don't need to go into any of that stuff. You can just read one of his books, The Philosophy of Freedom, which is a kind of inheritance of German idealism and this deep reflection on human self-consciousness and its relationship to the natural world, to this evolving cosmos. And so he's continuing this stream of thought that goes back to Johann Gottlieb Fichte and Friedrich Schelling, Goethe, and Hegel, to try to imagine how the freedom of the human being and this intelligibly organized universe can be compatible. Right? How is it that we can be free and we can have a scientific understanding of nature as, having regularities and ways that we can mathematically model it? Like, how is freedom and what we would call necessity in nature compatible? So he's really struggling with these problems. And this is what he says towards the end of Philosophy of Freedom, which forms the basis, I think, of his political and social impulse. He says, and please translate this into gender-neutral terms. This is just this translation. Steiner was actually very progressive for his time on gender issues, and we can get into that later. So he says, a man counts as a free spirit in a human community only to the degree to which he has emancipated himself from all that is generic. No man is all genus, none is all individuality, but every man gradually emancipates a greater or lesser sphere of his being, both from the generic characteristics of animal life and from the laws of human authorities, which rule him despotically. In respect to that part of his nature for which a human being is not able to win this freedom for himself, he forms a member with the organism of nature and of spirit. He lives in this respect by the imitation of others, or in obedience to their command. But ethical value belongs only to that part of his conduct which springs from his intuitions, right? From his creative thinking as a free individual, in other words. And whatever moral instincts a human being possesses through the inheritance of social instincts acquire ethical value through being taken up into his intuitions, made our own, in other words, in our own creative thinking. In such ethical intuitions, all moral activity of men has its root. To put this differently, the moral life of humanity is the sum total of the products of the moral imagination of free individuals. So ultimately, for Steiner, for threefolding to work, we're going to need to have individuals with free human individuals who have developed this moral imagination, where we act out of free creative impulses, not because someone told us that's how we're supposed to behave, not because we're obeying some authority, the law, the police, what have you, but a society organized around the free initiative, right, of human beings. And that means we need an educational context wherein the majority of human beings can be brought to that level of self-understanding and world understanding, which is why Waldorf education is became such an important part of threefolding. So is that the last thing I want to share on that slide? Well, let me share a few more things here. Steiner was the editor of Goethe's scientific work. Many people know that Goethe was a poet. He was also a statesman. He worked with the Duke of Weimar, Karl August. Not as many people at least are familiar with Goethe's scientific work on color, on the metamorphosis of plants, on bone morphology, and many other topics. Steiner actually edits all of these writings and publishes them. They ended up being 5 volumes. He's working on that for almost 2 decades, in the 1880s and 1890s. He's also very politically active, during this time period in the 1890s, editing many German magazines. He gets his doctorate in philosophy in 1891, actually on the German idealist Fichte, who is really again emphasizing the self and the creative thinking at the core of the human being, in his view, and it's sort of balancing. It's the pull and tension with Goethe, who's really focused on nature and its creativity. So Steiner has these 2 figures, Fichte the idealist and Goethe the naturalist, that he's trying to hold together and to arrive at a balanced view of the free human being, right, and this natural world, the context within which we realize our freedom. From 1899 to 1904, he was actually an instructor at a Marxist workers' school in Berlin. And also grew up in a working class context. His father worked for the railroad company, and so, industrialization is entering into Central Europe at this time, and Steiner's caught up into that, the birth of this working class, and later teaches in this workers' school, and so he knows the plight of the workers intimately, from the inside out, but is not a Marxist himself, because he's not a materialist, and we'll get to that. Around the turn of the century, he has an experience of what he calls the Christ event, and he begins to not just talk about philosophy and Goethe and write political articles, but he joins the Theosophical Society. He becomes the general secretary of the German Theosophical Society, actually, in 1902, and begins to lecture on all sorts of esoteric topics. Within a decade, or about 11 years later, because the Theosophical Society was going in a direction Steiner didn't like, they declared Jiddu Krishnamurti, this young Indian boy at the time, to be the second coming of Christ, and that was the last straw for Steiner. He broke from the Theosophical Society in 1913. He starts the Anthroposophical Society in Germany, which is kind of a Rosicrucian, esoteric, Christian spiritual impulse. But Steiner's also, lecturing about Buddha and Zarathustra and Krishna, and their importance in the spiritual world. So it's not just Christianity; it's a very inclusive spiritual worldview, but certainly rooted in what Steiner would call the Christ impulse, and his social impulse here, and which we'll turn to that now, because in 1914, just as he creates the Anthroposophical Society, just as he starts building the headquarters of anthroposophy in Dornach, Switzerland, called the Goetheanum, named after Goethe, World War I begins, right, in 1914. So Steiner, forgive me if you hear background noise, I'm here in the middle of downtown Oakland, so Steiner is in Dornach, Switzerland, neutral territory in Switzerland, right, watching Europe destroy itself, and construction on this Goetheanum is proceeding, the first Goetheanum at least, this beautiful wood-carved, domed structure, and he's giving lectures there, and he's also working on his reissuing, editing, and republishing some important books of his, including Philosophy of Freedom, which I just shared, which you could read as the kind of spiritual basis for this Christian anarchist view. And when I call him an anarchist, I don't mean he wants to tear down all government. Government has a role, but a much diminished role from the one we might be used to nowadays. And some of the other books he reissued at this time, An Outline of Occult Science, Christianity as Mystical Fact, get reissued at this time because he's just in Dornach. He can't travel through Europe, and he's reissuing these books. So there was a Russian Revolution towards the end of World War I, right? Lenin takes over establishes communism. He dies a few years later. Stalin takes over, right? So communism's rising to the east of Germany. And at this time, Steiner's taking a kind of top-down approach to threefolding. He's talking to Central European political leaders. He's talking to princes and foreign secretaries and cabinet ministers to persuade them that this threefolding idea is the way forward to rebuild and repair society after the war. By November 1918, none of these efforts Steiner's making with the elites, the leaders, are working. And, the war's about to end, and in October, the German army the generals feel humiliated, and they know that, peace will be declared soon, but they want one last jab at the British Navy. And so the generals, in October 1918, they call for one last major offensive against the British, and the soldiers refused. They mutiny. The German Navy mutinies. The dock workers join the Navy, and revolution explodes in Germany. Starts in Kiel and then moves to the rest of the country. And so the German social revolution is underway. The prince, who had been the chancellor, rather, of Germany at the time, Max von Baden, has to abdicate. That was one of the people Steiner had actually been speaking to about threefolding, but he's out. And then by November, World War I ends, millions of soldiers come home, and there's this real tension between the workers and the owners. The social problem at the time was wealth inequality, right? The social problem of our time, one of the major ones, is wealth inequality. And so what ended up happening is that workers' councils were established where capitalism was maintained, the workers kept their property, the capitalists kept their property, but the workers were given a better deal, given some say in how these factories, these companies were being run. There was a kind of left centrist party in Germany at the time, the Social Democrats, and they struck this deal and they avoided full communism, at least temporarily. At this point, Steiner gives up his top-down strategy and starts a threefold movement from the ground up, right? As he put it, he wants to now stop worrying about the politicians and the leaders who were barely in control of the country at that point anyways, and instead try to, as he put it, get the threefolding idea into as many human heads as possible, right? So he starts lecturing in 1919, 1920, 1921 about this. He publishes a book translated into English as Toward Social Renewal, which is reviewed in the New York Times, actually, eventually, and positively reviewed, and he's giving talks all over Europe to large crowds. Thousands of people would be in the audience many times. By 1921, he's really popular enough that he starts to get some pretty serious enemies, including Adolf Hitler, who in March 1921 actually writes in a German newspaper called the Völkischer Beobachter. Pronunciation is probably horrible. Folkist Observer is the translation, and so it's this right-wing populist magazine. And Hitler, he's not in power yet. The beer putsch would happen a year later, 2 years later. But he says in this article that he writes that Steiner's threefolding movement is, and I hate to quote Hitler, but here you go. He says Steiner's approach is a completely Jewish method of destroying people's natural state of mind. Steiner's not Jewish, but anything Hitler doesn't like or the Nazis don't like is Jewish, right? So as this opposition rises, Steiner actually is giving a talk in Munich at this point in 1921, and a bunch of nationalistic populist hooligans who support Hitler storm the stage, and this was 1922, in Munich. And so Steiner barely escapes through a back door, and so he realizes he needs to pull back this popular movement. One of the issues with threefolding is it's not socialist, it's not liberal, it's not just capitalist, it's not fascist, and so he was attacked from all sides because nobody felt like they could trust him. The workers initially were interested because he did take their plight seriously. He did understand that they were getting the short end of the stick, but he was also working with factory owners like Emil Moltz, who owned the Waldorf cigarette factory in Stuttgart, and was trying to balance these forces, right? Hold the tension between these different factions in German society. And so he had, a few years there where people were interested, but then because he wouldn't choose a side, so to speak, but wanted to balance these forces, these tensions, he started taking hits from all sides, and focused instead just on Waldorf education and the spiritual movement of anthroposophy that he was developing. By 1922, actually New Year's Eve, 1922, the Goetheanum, which had only recently been really finished, this is what it looked like. And it was built by workers from all around Europe, building it at the time that the war was going on, and so many of them are from countries that are at war with each other. And they're all here together building this Goetheanum. The wood is sourced from all over Europe. They're carving it by hand. And on New Year's Eve, 1922, someone burnt it down. It's suspected of having been arson. No one's quite sure who. But again, Steiner had enemies at this point. Other parties vying for control of Germany did not like the Threefolding movement, did not like anthroposophy. Steiner, I think this is actually him standing on top of the building here. Obviously this is a major blow, but apparently by the next morning he was continuing a planned lecture cycle in a nearby cabinet making workshop. Continuing to keep this flame alive. Well, that's the wrong metaphor in this case, but continuing this impulse. The Goetheanum would eventually be rebuilt. Here's a real picture of Steiner, surrounded by mostly women. As you can see, women were very much a part of the administration and then of the society, the Anthroposophical Society. This is the new Goetheanum that was designed by Steiner, but finished a few years after him. You can see it's made of cast concrete this time and not wood, a little more armored, you might say. I've been there. It's still beautiful, but the original seems to have been quite magical. Okay. So let's get into the idea of threefolding here. It's rooted in Steiner's understanding of what he would call the threefold human being. And so he's building an analogy here between his esoteric understanding of human nature and human physiology and of the makeup of the human being at every level. And he's building an analogy to the structure of society or of the social organism. But it's a bit of a tricky analogy that you might at first think you get, but as we'll see in a moment, it might be the reverse of your initial inclination. So let me first just share a bit here about Steiner's understanding of the human being as not just threefold. The human soul, he would say, is threefold. We're thinking, feeling, and willing beings. But we're also fourfold in another sense. So thinking, feeling, and willing is really how he would describe our astral existence, our astral body, as he'll sometimes say, or you could just say our soul. But there's also these other layers of our makeup, our physical body, or sometimes he'll call that the mineral layer of our existence, and that's basically what we are as a corpse. So when we die, what's left is the physical body, and as soon as the other bodies, the etheric, which I'll explain in a second, and the astral or the soul, and the spirit or the I, as soon as these other beings depart at death, all that's left is this corpse, which Steiner would say is basically it's one with the earth. It's mineral. It's quickly decays. The etheric body then is our life body, and we share this in common with plants. It connects us to light, to sunlight, and in some sense, Steiner also has an evolutionary understanding of each of these layers of the human being through different epochs of cosmic evolution. The physical was created first, and the etheric, and then the astral, and then the spiritual. It's a little more complicated than that. I don't have time to get into all of that, but this is an evolutionary picture. And I think there are ways to make this compatible with contemporary physics and biology and psychology. We need to be imaginative in how we do that. The astral body then again would be our emotional life, our thinking life, our sense of agency and effort and will. All of that is part of the astral body, what psychology studies. And then again, the spirit is the I, is the thinker, you could say, but in the West, in spiritual circles nowadays, in kind of a New Age context, the ego gets a bad name, a bad rap. We want to get rid of it. Steiner has a different view, coming again out of the philosophy of Fichte and the German idealists, of the eye as again, like a sort of portal to the spiritual world. It is that in us which does the thinking. It is an activity and not a thing, right? And so we don't want to mistake this for the horrible Cartesian ego that we're all trying to be rid of. I think it's a deeper idea than that, though again, we don't want to think of it as just an idea. So this is the fourfold makeup of the human being. But social threefolding is really rooted in his understanding of our soul, which again has this threefold nature. And so let's see how he looks at society. We've got the economic life, the political or rights life, and the cultural or spiritual life, right? And Steiner sees these as gradually differentiating over the course of human history. If you go back to ancient Egypt, there was still what the political philosopher Eric Voegelin would call a compact society, which means that culture, politics, and economics were pretty much all integrated into one institution, it was basically theocracy, right? Pharaoh and the temple and the priests, they run everything about the economy. I mean, the first banks who were giving farmers loans were also the temples, and, of course, who's making the laws and everything. So there's not democracy yet. There's not a marketplace, really. There's a theocracy. And so everything is under the control of the spiritual life, in a sense. And the Egyptian civilization gives us a good example of a pre-differentiated social organism. Now, over the course of thousands of years, these different spheres have gradually differentiated. Steiner would say that different, what he would call folk souls, different peoples, are especially good, if you look at history, at giving expression to the values of each of these spheres. And we could, there are different ways to look at this. I don't want to leave out countries, but we could look at Western Europe and say that the economic life is really exemplified in the English and American, not just English, the British and American mode of operation and cultural existence, whereas the French are especially driven by the rights life in this sense of freedom. You get the French Revolution. And in the cultural spiritual life, Steiner would say this is especially held by the Germans, right? It's often said that in the 18th century, when the French Revolution is happening in Paris, it's just in the wake of this that and before and during this time that in Germany, Immanuel Kant is inaugurating a kind of spiritual revolution on par with the political revolution that's going on in France, right? And so this is just a kind of a characterization, hopefully not a caricature, of how you can understand the folk souls that were carrying forward each of these domains. But the ideal is not for the British and the Americans to run the economy and the French to run politics and the Germans to run cultural life. No, this is supposed to be a scheme that any society can engage with and try to further in their own context, in their own unique ways. So the economy, basically for Steiner, has to do with our interaction with the physical earth. We are, as economic beings, as physical biological creatures, bound up in a single metabolic process with the planet Earth, right? Ecology really is the basis of economics, and of course we can see already the difference between how Steiner would imagine economic life and how our current, at least in the West, global capitalist, well, it's even in China, I mean, capitalism dominates the whole planet now, right? And doesn't really consider the ecological limits. So Steiner would definitely view the economy as part of the Earth system, and it's really about human needs and meeting human needs. Where do we get our food? In consumer capitalism, of course, human desire and the creation of ever new human desires plays a big role in the economy. That would be the creation of new human desires. Is not something Steiner would. He's not like a Puritan or something. But that would be more something for the cultural life to take up. There shouldn't be a profit motive driving the production of ever new human desires through PR and advertising and social media algorithms and whatever. And so our economic life is really out of balance right now. The political and rights life for Steiner concerns our feeling of our own rights as individuals, and also our feeling of the responsibility that we have to protect the rights of others. And the government and the legal system, for Steiner, should really be limited to the protection of rights and not the administration of things like education, things like healthcare, even things like the banking system. Steiner thinks that should be the free economic life that would be, yes, checked by the political sphere because individuals have rights, including workers, but that the administrative state that has increasingly come to encroach upon more and more aspects of our life, our cultural and our economic life, Steiner would really want to shrink that and protect individual rights. And there's this intuition and this instinct for fairness and justice that drives this sphere of existence. And it protects us from what might otherwise happen, both in the cultural sphere and in the economic sphere, right? It's protecting workers, it's protecting the environment in many cases, it's protecting students, say, even if they're going to schools which are not run by the state. Steiner would still say everyone has a right to education, right? And so this would be funded through gift money, otherwise known as taxes. Every child has access to quality education, but the parents would be choosing which schools, and the state, in Steiner's view, should not control cultural life because that would lead to what we have now, standardized testing driving the entire educational process. Teachers have no power to design their own curriculum, and students are treated as reduced to metrics, basically, that the standardized tests provide, and they're taught how to take the test. They're not taught music and science and an understanding of how to be a human being and what a human life is about. It's more like job training. So the cultural sphere for Steiner again becomes, it's where we do music and sports, it's media, it's healthcare, it's spiritual exploration, it's science, it's everything to do with the expression of individual human beings, right? And so while in the political sphere, the value is equality and fairness, right? And we really want to think about how everyone should be treated the same as a human being, regardless of their generic characteristics, whether that's sex, sexual orientation, gender, race, etc. In the cultural sphere, though, equality would still be protected. These are overlapping spheres, right? So the equality of everyone's still protected politically. But in the cultural sphere, we want to strive for excellence. And if we tried to impose equality in the cultural sphere, we're going to end up with homogeneity and mediocrity, right? And so while everyone should have be treated in the legal system fairly, while everyone should have, we shouldn't have this tremendous wealth inequality in our economic life. In culture, we're striving for excellence, and some degree of competition is appropriate. Steiner would say in the economic life, we really need to be thinking in an associative way, in a cooperative way, so that everybody can benefit from our economic decision-making. And producers and consumers and distributors should work together to make sure everybody benefits, because, in economic life, it's through the application of our intelligence as human beings, comes out of the cultural sphere. We apply that intelligence to nature, and we produce surpluses. And so Steiner would say, contrary to the usual capitalist way of thinking about an economy as having this problem of how to distribute scarce resources, Steiner would say we don't have a scarcity problem, we have a surplus problem. We have more than enough food to go around. The problem is how to distribute it fairly. And so cooperation should be really the name of the game in economics rather than competition. Competition is more appropriate in the cultural sphere, right? And in the political sphere, it's again about our fellow feeling, about our desire to protect everybody's rights and to come up with laws as to how we're to be responsible to one another. So in short, in the cultural sphere, freedom is the highest value, and it's about human capacities. In the political sphere, fairness is the highest value, and it's really about human relationships and our rights and responsibilities to each other. And in the economic sphere, we're really talking about fellowship and cooperation, and it's about meeting human needs. So maybe I'll just go for 5 more minutes. you might, as we try to build out this analogy between his understanding of the threefold human being, which you could summarize as, we are head, heart, and lungs, or what he'll call the rhythmic system, and hands, which is also what he refers to as the metabolic system. Thinking, feeling, and willing are also associated with these different systems. And so this is both a physiology and a spirituality for Steiner. And there's an analogy here with the social organism. And you might initially think that, okay, the head, thinking, that's culture. The heart, the rhythmic system, and feeling, that's politics. And then the hands, the metabolism, our willing life, that's economics. But actually, because Steiner wants to head off a materialistic understanding, that's not how we should think of it. So Steiner would say that materialist philosophy, otherwise known as Marxist philosophy, or that is otherwise known as historical materialism, tends to emphasize this fundamental importance of the modes and relations of productions, right? And so for a Marxist, culture, law, science, religion, and all these ideologies, they're just smoke rising from the modes and relations of production, ultimately, right? And it's really the material conditions that drive history. These are the reality that shape human life. And if we were to use just an external analogy to understand the social organism, we might say that, as I said, the head and the mind, thinking has to do with culture, the rhythmic system has to do with politics, and metabolism has to do with economics. But Steiner says this is definitely not the case. What he wants to point out here is that really the economic sphere compares best with the thinking activity of the human head. And we would be right to associate politics with feeling. And then the sphere of cultural life is actually best compared to the metabolism. And so this means that the reason he does this is that he wants us to think of the economic life as the head of the social organism, the cultural life as the stomach, which is different from the individual human being, right? Because the point here is economic life is dependent on cultural life. And cultural life then is like the metabolism that's feeding the economy, giving the economy new ideas to implement, applying our intelligence, right, to the natural world to get surplus, which we can call profit. But in a society where the profits generated by the economy are more equitably distributed, everybody benefits. And so this is an attempt to head off materialism, this inversion of what you might expect the analogy is between the threefold human being and the threefold society. And Steiner thinks that actually economic life is constantly bringing death into and decay into the progress of history, as he puts it. And this is related to his view of the human head and the brain and our thinking activity as related to death in some way, and that the rest of our body is keeping us alive. Because thinking is sort of where the spiritual world enters into the physiological and the biological world. And he sees the economy as similarly, ultimately the earth is going to die. The earth is an organism, and like all organisms, the earth as a physical, biological entity or system is going to die one day, just as every human being dies, right? And so while we want a more sustainable and even better, a more regenerative economy, eventually, right, the earth will be swallowed by the sun. And so for Steiner, he's thinking about a much deeper evolutionary future for the human being that would be on a spiritual level that is beyond even what might happen to the earth in a few billion years. But nonetheless, as we exist as physical creatures now, the economy and our interface with the physical earth, the energy flows, the food that we need, we are depleting the earth. Right, and so we should understand that and see that it's the cultural life that's bringing enlivening, vital ideas into human society to help the economic sphere find more regenerative ways, more intelligent ways of interacting with the earth. We're not trying to, we need to be more ecologically sensitive and not rush this process, but there's no way around the fact that the earth is going to die. So, for Steiner, cultural life is really the key here. And, the last thing I'll say, and then we'll open it up. There's so much more to share, and I'm sure there are lots of questions. one way to think about these spheres is to use, Wilber's I, we, and it kind of grammatical distinction. Cultural life, again, is about the I, right? Cultivating this individual freedom. Political life is about the we, fellow feeling, and our sense of responsibility to one another to protect our rights and the rights of others. And economic life is really about the it world, our interface with nature, right? But you can see I have these shapes overlapping because much of our economic life involves relationships to other animals and to plants, and I think there's a way in which they are also part of this we shared existence, this second person political life. And so to some extent, we would want to grant rights of a kind, to the non-human world and not just put everything non-human into the it category. And I think, we can certainly need to find ways, and have to some degree found ways, of bringing the living world into the political sphere, and to consider animals and even plants as part of the we, even while we also have to eat. And so there's a degree to which the non-human world does become it, right? And we can do that in reverent ways, eating those that we also consider to be part of our community, non-human, broader community. So I think I should stop there. This is, there's so much more to say about his proposals for money and community banking, and what he would say about real estate and wage labor and the problems with that. And hopefully, there are questions about those things, and we can get into that in the conversation here. Let me stop sharing my screen here. There we go. All right. Bit of a crash course. I know I was speaking fast.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. That was rich. And you got my gears turning. Do you have any specific way you want to do the discussion, or do you want to just do kind of a Q&A and invite people to ask questions, make comments, whatever's...
Maybe if there aren't any questions that people are jumping to ask, one way to frame this, and I know one option was to do quick breakouts, but a question I might ask you in light of threefolding, which I've just sketched for you, just the barest outline, is to think about democracy, which is such an important value for us in the West and in America, most of us at least. And where is democracy, the impulse to be democratic, where is it appropriate? Are there some areas of human life and coexistence where maybe it's not as appropriate, it's maybe relevant, but to actually take a vote on a question, say, in a laboratory, scientific laboratory, it might not be the most appropriate place for democracy, but where is it appropriate? I think that's an interesting question to ask, and then to see how threefolding might respond to the question.
So, Matthew, in connection with your presentation, I've been reading up on Steiner and appreciating him. Of course, I've known about him for most of my adult life, but really come to appreciate how what a massive genius he was, right? How much he contributed both to his time and to our time. Like when you talk about by their fruits you shall know them. Not only is Waldorf School an amazing spiritual fruit of Steiner's genius, but so is biodynamic farming, right? That's another thing he invented it. And so if I could just, now that we're back together, go ahead and give you my question about this, which is where or how we can perhaps find a rightful place for Steiner in the larger canon of spiritual philosophy overall. Given his massive genius, and given his, some of the things he said that were, products of his time. If he was alive today, I'm sure he'd admit they were mistakes. But as not only, an important German philosopher, but also as in some ways one of the leading lights, or the fathers of progressive spirituality, right? So much esoteric and occult spirituality, what later blossomed into what we call progressive spirituality, right? Which has, good and bad elements, but certainly is a major part of American culture and elsewhere in the world. Where do you see Steiner fitting into the canon, and how do you think we can appreciate his contribution more appropriately?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There's a film made by the great BBC documentarian Jonathan Stedall, the late Jonathan Stedall, died a few years ago, on Steiner, and it's called The Challenge of Rudolf Steiner. And, he's a challenging figure. I think there is a continuing sort of anthroposophical movement that's very strong. The Waldorf movement is very strong. It's also, there's a lot of concern within that community of aging out. A lot of the, people are getting older and wondering where the young people are who might continue to carry forward that movement of anthroposophy. But there's also such interest in his work just by the general public that really don't consider themselves anthroposophists or really have any interest in becoming part of that. And I think to some degree anthroposophy might have moved in a direction of becoming its own kind of religion, which was not Steiner's intention. And this question of there's quite a large movement of critics, especially in Europe. I'm becoming more aware of that, who are concerned about the racism. He did make some comments that can only be understood as racist. Now, whether or not he himself was sort of racist, there is a sense in which, as you said, his time and place in Central Europe and most of Europe and America 100 years ago, even scientists, there was this kind of scientific racism that was quite prevalent, and that only shifted after World War II because of what happened in Nazi Germany in large part. But as you should have noticed, as I hope became clear, Steiner was certainly opposed to the Nazi movement, and they were opposed to him. So he was not white supremacist in that sense, but he definitely had a Eurocentric view of history. Although, he would say that in the past, different civilizations outside of Europe were carrying the mantle, and in our time, and though it might be shifting already, Europe has been carrying the mantle in the modern period, and in the future, that'll shift, right? And he, despite these, there's probably a dozen comments that he makes that I think we have to call racist. There's 300 volumes of lectures printed and dozens of books. In most of that writing, he says that nationalism and racism and sexism are regressive and have no place in the present and future of human evolution. And he's quite articulate and strong in those opinions. But it's one of those things where there's so many figures in history where there's a temptation to want to cancel them because of some things that they said and throw out everything that may be of value to us. And I don't think we should cancel Rudolf Steiner. I think he should continue to be an important voice who has so much to contribute across all the domains, seemingly all the domains of human life. And he's quite integral in his thinking. He has his own language, though, that kind of comes out of theosophy, kind of comes out of Rosicrucianism, but also comes out of German idealism. And so we can read him as, I think, the culmination of German idealism in some sense. Owen Barfield, English writer and philosopher who studied Steiner quite deeply, thought of anthroposophy and Steiner's movement as and ideas as romanticism come of age. So not retro-romanticism, but romanticism matured in dialogue with the sciences and trying to bring the fruits of imagination, which are so promising in art and literature, into the social world, into agriculture, into, politics and economics, banking. Like, he really wants to bring that out into the world where romanticism, traditionally was more of an inward kind of journey. Steiner's applying it to transform the world in really positive ways, I think. So.
No, I agree. Just like a little bit like Abraham Lincoln, the context of his life makes it clear that he was not, kind of a horrible racist. He just said some unfortunate things, and I think Steiner has a similar situation.
Yeah.
Thanks. We have time for a couple questions, and I see a couple people already have their hands raised. So please, if you do have a question, use the react button, raise your hand, and we'll try to get to them. We'll go David and then Matt. Try to keep your question kind of brief, under a minute.
Yeah, thank you. Matthew, great presentation. I appreciate it. Fellow CIS, PCC alum here back in 2001, so appreciate seeing the Institute continue to represent.
Thanks.
My question specifically, you mentioned earlier that one of the keys for Steiner was that you're only free to the degree that you're individuated out of your localized culture of embeddedness. I'm paraphrasing a bit there, but the degree of true freedom is to the degree you're separated out from your culture yet still attached, which really jives a lot with some of the integral thinkers like Keegan with self-authoring coming out of socialized mind, etc. So at the level of education, how would you speak to the Waldorf method, especially for teenagers and above, who are able now to sort of individuate? And so what would that ladder of education look like that gets people out of the third order to the fourth order to most efficiently and effectively help support, drive personal evolution through individuation? And then what would be guardrails so that the people on the ladder aren't being clawed back by the people in the culture of embeddedness, like Steiner was clawed back when he wasn't on a side, so everybody hated him, and which is a trend you see from Socrates all the way up to the current day. Independent thinking is frowned upon in this establishment, would be a paraphrase for the US today. So what does that ladder look like? What's the strength and what are the guardrails there?
Yeah, great question. I'll try to briefly answer it. Steiner would say education is really about allowing the individuality already latent in the child to blossom and flower, and that the problem with a kind of homogeneous one-size-fits-all approach to education is that it leaves no room for the individuality of the child. And so that's the first thing. Education should encourage the child to discover their gifts instead of having a standardized curriculum, imposed on high. The Waldorf approach is to begin in kindergarten and to try to recapitulate human history in a developmental sense so that the child relives the various phases of human evolution through their childhood. And so you begin really with working with the hands to build, practical tools to work with, and with the arts, molding clay and telling stories. And Steiner, Waldorf schools are famous or infamous, depending on the side you take, for introducing reading like a year or so later than most public schools, because Steiner thought actually, until the child becomes 7 or 8 years old, they're still in a kind of narrative consciousness, kind of oral consciousness, just like early human beings. And that's when you really want to live into stories and myths, and you want to teach them world mythology at that stage, because they can really connect with it. And when we rush to the alphabet, we're not allowing that developmental process to unfold naturally. The alphabet's really important, and Waldorf students learn that too, and they learn math and science, but they learn it in a more tangible, tactile, sensory way, right? And so they're studying light with prisms, and they're studying astronomy by going outside at night with their teachers to see the stars, and they're studying biology by watching plants grow together, and they use textbooks, but actually Waldorf students make their own textbooks, and they learn how to draw and how to create the knowledge. And you could say recreate the knowledge. The teacher is there to help them understand, how all these things work. But the idea is that the student internalizes that and then recreates it and expresses it in their own way, makes their own textbook. And so this is all in service of the development and deepening of individuality, but in the context of a loving community, right? And so Steiner's very much emphasizing the I as like the spiritual core of who and what we are as human beings, but we shouldn't think of that as this separate, isolated Cartesian ego. It's from that I that we have this moral imagination, Steiner says, that really lets us relate to one another at a deep level. And so, Waldorf education is trying to welcome new human beings into this life, recapitulating the evolution of our species through its developmental stages, and then saying, baton's yours, let's carry this evolution forward. So much more to say, but I'll stop there so we can get a couple more questions in.
Let's see if we can, Matt, Be brief.
Yeah.
Sure. Hey, Matt. It's nice to meet you. I've seen you in some of the meta modern spaces, and so it's nice to connect. And it's great to hear you talk about Steiner. I've been a big fan of Steiner for a long time. My question is, I feel like humanity as a whole is just beginning to learn in the democratic system how to shift culture. Like I said in my group that I'm concerned about the culture war in the United States, for example. And there you can hear people say things like, we've got to do this or we've got to do that. But I feel like we're just beginning to understand that. And I'm wondering, when you talk about social threefolding, when you talk about the idea that like culture is the hand or the will of the culture, and that sort of cultural level engineering, what are the ways that Steiner provides unique insight into that process? Do you know? Do you have a sense of that?
I mean, the idea of threefolding is not a revolutionary program. I described him as an anarchist, but he's not saying let's tear down the existing institutions and structures. He's saying let's build, and this is what anarchists talk about, build lateral power, like alternative institutions that work alongside existing institutions, and build the alternative you want to see and bring people along with you. And so, when threefolding failed as a mass movement in Germany in 1921-22, Steiner turned his attention to the Waldorf school movement and to build these schools, in a sense, to sow the seeds of the future in the children that would come through these schools to be better equipped, in the next generation maybe, to continue with these ideas, because it's not there's no plan from on high that's going to solve our problems. It really is about there is a kind of spiritual awakening that would be required for threefolding to unfold. Our economic religion of capitalism, I think I have to call it nowadays, really emphasizes human vices and treats human beings as though we're reducible to our greed and selfishness, right? And anything besides that, love, compassion, etc., we don't expect that of people, right? The models that economists use, rationality in the economic models is, how can I exploit others to get the most out of this exchange, And Steiner would say that's not a good reflection of human nature. We're actually more than that. We want others to succeed. We want to, we have a sense of sympathy naturally for other human beings and empathy, and that our economic system is actually squashing our virtues and leading us through a self-fulfilling prophecy to become more greedy and selfish and lonely and competitive. And so there's a kind of spiritual awakening that needs to occur to remind us who we are. And the good news is human cultural life will always be vibrant and transformative, and you never know. Look at human history. You never know when a new spark is going to light something off, and Steiner's really saying, don't look to the politicians, don't look to the capitalist corporations. We're going to have to turn to ourselves and our communities, our friendships, the bonds that we form through free association to turn the ship around, right? So start where you are, It's not that you shouldn't vote and do all the stuff that is required of you in existing institutions, but start where you are to build the alternative.
Man, such an empowering message. Well, let's give Matt a big round of applause. Thank you so much. I feel like we're just getting started with the discussion as usual, but we'll just have to continue the discussion in our community, and when we upload the video, please comment and ask questions. And Matt, if you're willing to just kind of keep an eye on that thread and answer any questions as they come up, I think that would be fantastic. Our next meetup will be Wednesday. It's always the second Wednesday of the month, Wednesday, September 11th, and it will be discussion based. As far as I know, we won't have a guest presenter, and we'll do some discussion questions. So thank you all for showing up and making this a great presentation and discussion. I'll see you all next month.
Thanks, Rigel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
And that all